היי!
ערב טוב לכולם, ותודה שהצטרפתם ל-JavaScript Israel, המיטאפ של מאי. לפנינו עומד להיות מיטאפ לדעתי מאוד מאוד מעניין, שהולך להתעסק בקצת ביצועים, שזה משהו שכולנו צריכים להכיר, לדעת בעולם הווב, בעולם שבו אנחנו מתכנתים, וכמובן גם בעולמות אחרים שקשורים ל-JavaScript. אז לפני שאנחנו מתחילים, אני רוצה להזכיר לכם שיש לנו הגרלה לוואלאבי ולקוואקה, יש את הלינק למטה של JS Winning, תירשמו וכמובן תוכלו בסוף האירוע להגריל את הדברים האלה, נשמע לי מגניב. אם אתם מעוניינים להעביר הרצאה ב-JavaScript Israel, ביטלי, JSIL-CFP ואתם מוזמנים להצטרף אלינו לרשימת המרצים. אנחנו כל חודש בוחרים או מוציאים CFP כזה או אחר ועם נושאים מסוימים, אז כך שאם יש לכם משהו מעניין לדבר עליו ואתם רוצים לשתף עם הקהילה, אז אני מזמין אתכם להצטרף אלינו. היום יהיה לנו מרצה חדש, ינאי אדרי, שעומד להעביר הרצאה ראשונה, פעם ראשונה במיטאפ, פעם ראשונה שהוא לא מארגן מיטאפ אלא ממש מעביר הרצאה. אז אם אתם רוצים, אתם יכולים. אני מזכיר לכם כמובן שיש לנו Code of Conduct בביטלי JSIL-Conduct, בבקשה אנא תהיו אליין בתגובות שלכם בפורום ביוטיוב, לא לרשום כל מיני דברים לא מכבדים וכדומה. לגבי ניוז של JavaScript, אז הדבר העיקרי שאני יכול לציין עליו בחודש האחרון זה פרופיילר חדש של אנגולר. למיטב זיכרוני יש מיטאפ שעומד להיות בקרוב ב1.6, שזה בשבוע הבא פה בארץ, נראה לי באנגולר ישראל, שעומד להציג את הפרופיילר הזה. מאוד מעניין לדעתי אם אתם מגיעים מעולמות האנגולר, לצערי אני בעיקר מתעסק בעולמות ריאקט, אז זה פחות מעניין לפחות אותי כרגע. כמובן שאני רוצה להודות גם למרצים שלנו, למייקל, לינאי ולאדם שעומדים להצטרף ולתת לכם הרצאות לדעתי מאוד מעניינות, ולספיקר בדיז יונתן קרב ורן וואלה שהם הספיקר בדיז שלנו החודש. לכל מרצה שבעצם רוצה להעביר הרצאה אנחנו משתפים אותו ביחד עם ספיקר בדי שעובר איתו על ההרצאות ובוחן את ההרצאות ונותן פידבקים לפני ההרצאה כמובן, כדי שיהיו הרצאות מעניינות וטובות. אז כמה מילים מבית טרקס שהם הספונסר של האירוע. אני מעביר את השרביט לקרן מטרקס שתוכל קצת להסביר לכם, ואחרי זה אנחנו נחזור ונדבר על ההרצאות ונציג את המרצה הראשון שלנו לערב. אז קרן, הבמה שלך.
אז קודם כל שלום לכולם, אני בעצם קרן, אני רכזת גיוס בחברת טרקס. כן רציתי ככה לתת לכם כמה מילים על החברה שלנו. אז אנחנו בעצם חברה שהוקמה בסינגפור ב-2010 על ידי שני ישראלים, יואל בראל ודרור פלדהיים. אנחנו חברת סאס, חברת דאטה שעושה דיגיטיזציה לעולם הריטייל על ידי טכנולוגיה של זיהוי תמונה, Image Recognition. אנחנו בעצם מתמחים בעולמות האלה של ה-AI. התמונות מצולמות באמצעות אפליקציה, יש לנו גם מצלמות קבועות שיושבות על מדפים, רובוט שמסתובב בין המעברים, וברגע שתמונה מצולמת היא עולה לענן, עוברת תהליך של זיהוי במנועים של טרקס, וככה אנחנו מפיקים דוחות, דשבורדים ומגוון סוגי דאטה שנותנים אינדיקציה עסקית ללקוחות שלנו. הלקוחות, יש לנו לקוחות גלובליים ב-80 מדינות בעולם, גם החברות היצרניות, ה-CPGs כמו קוקה קולה, הייניקן, ג'ונסון אנד ג'ונסון, וגם הריטלרים עצמם, בעצם סופרים גדולים כמו וולמארט בארצות הברית, שופרסל פה בארץ, ובעצם החברה שלנו מונה היום בסביבות 1,000 עובדים, בשנתיים האחרונות הייתה לנו צמיחה מאוד משמעותית, גם כתוצאה מגדלה ארגונית והתרחבות עסקית, וגם כתוצאה מרכישה של 6 חברות בעולמות הריטייל טק, ולכן העובדים שלנו יושבים ב-20 משרדים ברחבי העולם. יש לנו אתר מאוד גדול בתל אביב של 250 עובדים, בבניין תוצרת הארץ, ממש סמוך לעזריאלי, ובעצם שאר העובדים מתפרסים לארצות הברית, סין, סינגפור, יפן, דרום אמריקה, בודפסט, פריז, רוסיה. זה ככה באמת בגדול על החברה. אני כן אשמח להראות לכם איזשהו סרטון קצר שבעצם מדבר על מה שאנחנו עושים, ולאחר מכן אני אעבור קצת לחומר האנושי.
We started Trax with a big ambition to help every manufacturer and retailer maximize the value of every shelf and every store. And so, we pioneered a new way forward for the industry. We built a breakthrough computer vision and analytics platform that digitizes every product in every aisle by using cameras here, and here. We capture images of what's happening on the shelf and turn them into granular, actionable insights at global scale. Trax delivers a single source of shelf truth that empowers the world's brands to perfect their shelf execution in store visits and retailers to enhance their operational efficiencies every day in every store. We help them focus on their retail fundamentals and find new ways to improve the way products perform on the shelf in real time. The right products are in the right positions at the right price, and promotions work more effectively. Trax brings a whole new level of detail to retail, giving you confidence that teams are always on the same page, making smarter, more accurate decisions from store to headquarters. The end result is an optimized way to stock, sort, sell, and even shop. And we're only just getting started, with new innovations coming up that not only allow customers to shop more efficiently, but unlocks smarter shelf strategies for our clients. More and more companies are harnessing the power of shelf data, because to transform your business, you need to transform the health of every shelf.
מעולה. אז בעצם מלבד ככה המידע שראיתם, קצת חשוב לי לספר לכם גם על החומר האנושי בחברה. אז בעצם יש לנו אווירה מאוד מאוד טובה בחברה, אנחנו אומנם חברה גדולה, אך עדיין עם אווירה משפחתית של סטארט-אפ, הפריה מקצועית הדדית, חברויות שהן מעבר לשעות העבודה, וגם בעצם מצליחים גם לשמור על איזון בית עבודה. הרבה מהגיוסים שלנו הם גם דרך חבר מביא חבר, ומבחינת פיתוח קריירה, אנחנו בעצם יש לנו אינפו-סשנס על נושאים טכנולוגיים ותחביבים, ג'ונו שזה פלטפורמה של קורסים לעובדים, מסלולי אונבורדינג לעובדים חדשים, לכל עובד שלנו יש בעצם תקציב לקורסים, כנסים, מיטאפים, יש לנו בעצם לאחרונה טרקסטוק שאנחנו עושים, שעובדים חולקים ידע, כל פעם עובד אחר מרצה, חשוב לנו לשמר גם את העובדים הטובים שלנו ולקדם אותם לתפקידים בחברה ולפתח מסלולי פיתוח קריירה. מבחינת רווחה, בעצם בתקופת הקורונה זה היה לבחירת העובד אם להגיע למשרד או לעבוד מהבית או לשלב, זה היה לגמרי לבחירתו, והקפדנו על ביצוע אירועים וירטואליים, היה לנו לדוגמה Well-being Month, כל שבוע מרצה אחר דיבר על החשיבות באמת של הנושא הזה של עבודה מהבית, איזון בית עבודה, כל עובד קיבל תקציב להום אופיס, שלחנו חבילות לבתים, לאחרונה מאחר והחיסונים תפסו תאוצה, אז גם היה לנו אירוע Get Together בים בהרצליה, ובעצם אנחנו ממשיכים לקיים גם happy hours בימי חמישי ובחגים, לפני הקורונה ועכשיו בעצם שהחיסונים תפסו תאוצה, אנחנו עוברים למודל עבודה היברידי, שזה 2-3 פעמים בשבוע מהמשרד, השאר מהבית, ואנחנו מחזירים את שאר הפעילויות שהיו לפני הקורונה, שזה בעצם המסיבות קיץ מבני זוג, יום ילדים באוגוסט, מסיבת פורים, טיול פעם בשנה אוברנייט, אנחנו גם מקפידים לצאת להתנדבויות שונות, לדוגמה יצאנו לחלוקת אוכל, לניקוי חופים שהיה לא מזמן, ובכללי יש לנו גם קבוצת כדורסל בחברה ולהקה, אז בהחלט כיף אצלנו, וככה מי שירצה לשמוע פרטים נוספים, המייל שלי יעבור הלאה למטה, וכמובן תהנו בהרצאות. תודה רבה.
תודה רבה קרן, ובאמת מעניין. Now I'm going to move to English because our first guest speaker is Michael Liao from the Edge team, and Michael is going to talk about something very interesting, and I won't steal your stage, Michael, so your stage is yours and good luck. You are muted.
Okay, sorry about that. Hey everyone. So I hope everyone's ready for a great day of talks. My name is Michael, and I'm going to be talking about how my team and I are bringing the Edge DevTools to Visual Studio Code. So let's start with a little bit about myself. My name is Michael Liao. My pronouns are he, him, and his. And if you want to contact me, my email is michael.liao@microsoft.com. I've been a DevTools software engineer at Microsoft for a little over 3.5 years at this point. And in my time here, I've worked on adding accessibility to Chromium DevTools. I've created a font editing tool, and currently I'm the subject matter expert for the Edge DevTools for VS Code extension. But the extension wouldn't be where it is today without the team behind it. So I'd like to give a shout out to the team. We have program managers Chris and Jason. Chris will actually be in the chat to answer questions along the way. And then the developers are Brandon, myself, Olivia, and Vidal. And then I'd also like to give a special thanks to the original developer of the extension, James Lisiak, who built the foundation of the tools, of the extension for clarity. Now for the agenda. So the first topic is, what are the developer tools for Visual Studio Code? In this section, we'll be going over an overview of the Edge DevTools and also VS Code. And what problems are we trying to solve? This will be going over the pros and cons of both products. And how we're creating the extension, that's going to go over the origins as well as the architecture. And then in problems and solutions, we'll be going over some of the hardships that we faced along the journey and our approaches to solving them. And what's next, it'll be kind of going over how we're looking to improve and what we're focusing on next. So let's begin. What are the Edge developer tools for Visual Studio Code? So to answer that, let's first ask, what are the Edge dev tools? Well, since the rebirth, Microsoft Edge has been based off the Chromium project, and so the Edge dev tools have been based off the Chromium dev tools. There's a powerful suite of HTML, CSS, and rendering tools, as well as visual tooling as well, like color pickers and animation sliders that kind of help choose the right value for your CSS properties without having to mess around with all the different values. You can also go to the network tool to monitor network traffic, or go to the sources tab and edit your files, set breakpoints, and there's plenty of other tools as well. Now let's talk about Visual Studio Code. It's based on the Electron Chromium project, and as you may know, it's probably one of the most popular lightweight IDEs available. There's a ton of built-in features such as terminal emulation, debugging. You can access Git directly from the terminal. And my favorite part is that it's super customizable and extensible and has a big wealth of different extensions built off VS Code's extension API. And we took advantage of that too by creating the Edge DevTools for Visual Studio Code. So if you want to learn a little bit more, go to aka.ms/devtools for code, or simply just search for us in the marketplace. But now let's go through a little bit of a demo. And as a disclaimer, I've had plenty of issues in the past working these video demos. So if you're going to have any technical issues, it's going to be at this part. But I'll try my best. So as you can see over here, we have the VS Code window, and then we have the extension selected on the left-hand screen. When we press open a new tab, it launches an instance of Edge and creates an instance of the DevTools in a tab inside your VS Code environment. So let's go a little bit further. You go to localhost and let's add a couple of items to our shopping list. As you can see, each item that we add is creating a console message that's outputted directly into VS Code. So what's happening here is that these console messages are read through by the DevTools and then outputted directly to the VS Code output window. We can also inspect elements on the page as well. So by clicking this button up here on the top left of the DevTools, we can go over to the browser page and select a task element. And then from there, we can see what CSS properties are applied. And let's say you want to change the background color. We can use the color picker tool to choose this shade of red instead of figuring out what the hex value for that red is. Additionally, you can navigate through the DOM tree and find elements this way as well, and it'll highlight it on the target page. And lastly, you can go to the network pane and see what kind of network activity is on your target page. So in this next demo over here, we'll be kind of going over like an alternative workflow. So let's say you don't want to launch another instance of the browser. You can actually go to the VS Code settings of our extension and launch the browser in headless mode, and then see the browser on your screen using a screencast. So in the Edge DevTools, you can see on the left-hand side is sectioned off for a screencast, which is toggled using this button over here. And this screencast has the functionalities of a browser target. So if you want to inspect an element, you can click on the inspect tool and then hover over the screencast to select the same task element. And one thing that's really fun about working in the VS Code environment is that we can have a deeper integration with source mapping. So for instance, let's say you want to edit the background color like last time. you'll notice that the relevant style sheet actually appears on the left-hand side. So you don't even need to know where these properties live, because VS Code and our extension will do that for you. And besides editing, you can also access the style sheet through a little link in the top right of the style section. And that concludes pretty much the demo for now. And so let's go over to what problems are we trying to solve with our extension. So let's talk about VS Code. As I said before, there's a lot of built-in functionality. You have debugging, you have a built-in version control. There's a ton. And it's an excellent editor, and it has really good JavaScript debugging features, but it's really missing some visual tooling to help, debug your sites. And that's kind of where the Edge DevTools comes in. The DevTools contains a great wealth of visual debugging tools, but one con is that the sources editor has a lot to be desired. It's really not as comfortable to edit inside the DevTools sources pane as it is your favorite IDE. And we do have a workspace feature that synchronizes your files in the DevTools with your local files, but we've seen the user interactions and that leaves lots to be desired. So that's why we think that merging the two fixes these weaknesses, because we play on each other's strengths and cover each other's weaknesses. Now we have an excellent editor and debugger workflow, and then you add the powerful tools, visual tools of the Edge DevTools right in the editor. And I want to emphasize that we're placing these DevTools directly in the VS Code window because it minimizes context switching, which further promotes the idea that VS Code contains most, if not all, of the end-to-end developer workflow. So let's talk a little bit about the origins of the extension, how we created it. So the origin actually began around in March 2019 with the Elements for VS Code extension, which is a side project created by James Lisiak of the DevTools team. And the Elements tool rendered essentially the elements, the DevTools Elements tool in the VS Code window. And then about a year later, in March of 2020, the Network for VS Code extension was created, which was a fork of the Elements tool, except instead of showing the Elements tool, it showed the Network tool. But at this point, we kind of had a couple of questions that came our way, such as if we wanted to create another tool to put in as an extension, would we have to create another extension for it? At which point we would have 3 extensions. And also each extension took up a space in the VS Code sidebar. And so that's kind of valuable real estate. So due to these concerns and a couple of others, we actually created the Microsoft Edge DevTools for VS Code in October of 2020, which is the extension that we're working on today. So a little bit about the transformation from a side project to a product is really about understanding the value. So one part of the value is just that we want to demonstrate that we can host the Edge DevTools in a different environment and still provide the same utility to our users. Additionally, we figured that we could tap into the VS Code's user base and kind of highlight the utilities that the Edge DevTools can provide for visual debugging. So from here, we worked to improve the developer workflow. So we expanded the team. Initially, it was maybe like 1 or 2 engineers, and now we have a team of 2 PMs to help with direction and 4 developers. We also added a CI system to make sure that everything that we're checking in isn't breaking any tests or breaking any builds. And then we also updated linting to match the Edge DevTools so we can maintain a standard of code quality. Additionally, we wanted to lower the barrier of contribution. So before, we would ask contributors to download 2 to 3 gigabytes of Edge files, which includes the browser files, just to extract 10 to 20 megabytes of the DevTools files. But now we've created a script that just downloads the relevant files, and you don't have to worry about the rest. So now let's talk about pretty much the technicals of how the extension really works. So we utilize the remote debugging capabilities of the DevTools to attach to our browser target. Remote debugging in the browser DevTools is usually used to connect to remote targets or to connect to like a mobile device that's connected to your machine. And we host the DevTools inside a web view, which renders inside a tab in VS Code. But one thing to note is that the DevTools that we're rendering there isn't an exact replica of the browser DevTools. We actually apply a bunch of patches so we can help with the integration to VS Code and also fit the functionality that we want. So an example of this would be rerouting the console messages from the DevTools to VS Code. Additionally, we have a messaging system that passes along information from the DevTools through the extension to the debug target. And this will be further explained in the next slide, which talks more about the architecture. And the fun thing about this is that besides the browser code itself, everything else is written in JavaScript and TypeScript. That includes all the extension code and all the DevTools code as well. So now let's talk a little bit about the architecture. So there's really 3 main parts of the extension architecture. There's the edge side where you have your browser instance and the tab, which is the debuggable target. And then you have the VS Code side and the WebView side. So over here, the browser communicates with the panel socket. So that's how it sends information back to the DevTools. The panel socket communicates with the DevTools panel, and the DevTools panel is kind of like, imagine a communication hub between the edge and the WebView section. It gets messages from both the browser and the DevTools, and it decides which ways to send each message. From there, you can look at the WebView, which has a host and the DevTools. So the host is kind of the portal, the point of communication out of the DevTools to VS Code. And DevTools itself, the browser DevTools, has an inspector frontend host, and we overrode that with our own custom host so that we could, implement the VS Code integration. So let's talk about some problems and some solutions that we ran into. So one issue that we ran into recently was regarding local resource loading in iFrames. So a little bit of context for the DevTools is that we have a file called inspector.html, which contains a couple of scripts that are responsible for the boot up of the DevTools. So when we first created the extension, the easiest way to get the DevTools to render in VS Code was to simply create an iframe and set its source to inspector.html, at which point the scripts inside inspector.html would handle the rest of the booting up of the DevTools. Unfortunately, VS Code deprecated local resource loading in iframes due to some consistency issues between VS Code experiences on different platforms. And this kind of left us in a tough spot because without local resource loading, our extension was broken. And this change would make it into stable in a matter of weeks and would break the experience for all of our users. So we had to think quickly. Some potential solutions that we came up with was hosting the DevTools files in the cloud. We would just upload them and then set the iframe source to the cloud resource. However, due to some security issues, this didn't pass and it was blocked on VS Code side. On another solution that we came up with was to actually serve these files, the DevTools files, in a local host server. And since this wasn't a local resource technically, and we were able to actually get this to work, but we actually figured a better solution in the end. So I'm going to talk about it through an architecture model because I feel like that makes the most sense. So over here, you can see it's the old slide, except the edge and VS Code sections are pretty much the same. And we can see there's a couple of extra components in the WebView section, namely the DevTools.html, which acts as the iframe. Additionally, there's also a messaging class in between the host and the DevTools panel that handles messaging outside of the iframe and communicates those messages to the VS Code. So one thing that we were able to do is we were able to actually implement the host and the DevTools and put that all directly inside the WebView HTML instead of needing to use the iframe or inspector.html. At which point we realized that the messaging class really wasn't doing too much because it's no longer communicating out of the iframe into VS Code, and the host lives inside the WebView HTML already. So we removed the messaging class altogether. And now we have to create a more direct channel of communication between the DevTools panel and the host. And that's what we did. And this ended up actually being our current architecture. So because of this bug, we're able to actually simplify our architecture and remove a couple of unneeded classes. Another issue that we ran into was that we realized we had a pretty high number of tire kickers. And for those who are not familiar, the term tire kickers actually originate from car dealerships, where you would have people who would walk in and then kick a couple of tires to show that they're interested and then leave without actually buying anything. So in the context of our extension, a tire kicker is someone who comes in, installs the extension, tries it out once, and then never really comes back to it. And we realized that almost half of our users never came back and were classified as tire kickers. And so we hypothesized it was due to maybe the steep learning curve to start the extension and that they weren't really seeing the value of the extension right away. But we had to be sure. So we realized that we needed to understand our user base a little bit better. And so we invested time and resources into bolstering the telemetry of the Edge DevTools. And we also conducted user interviews so we can have face-to-face interactions about, where people got stuck and why people stopped using the extension. And then lastly, we worked on improving the first launch experience by adding and updating documentation, and we created start instructions in the sidebar. So if you noticed, in the examples before, in this section over here, the sidebar was actually blank, but we actually created documentation here to make sure that users were able to get started right away. This includes having a launch instance button that will launch the Edge instance and connect to DevTools, we have a configure launch.json button that will help either configure or create a launch.json that utilizes our extension properly. And if this doesn't answer any questions, we also have a link to the docs on the GitHub page. So let's talk about what we have coming up next and what we're focused on. So we're constantly looking to improve. As said before, we're conducting user interviews to find out where people are stuck and what could be better. We're also improving documentations and demo projects to really showcase the utility our extension provides and get people started faster. And we're also looking for ways to improve the extension by listening to our users for what features they're asking for, what kind of broken experiences they're running into. And as always, we're really closely monitoring our user-submitted issues on our GitHub page. So one thing that I want to emphasize is that, as you can probably notice, we're very user-centric in our approach to designing this extension. So that means that your voice really does matter, and we're always listening. And lastly, we're also looking to enhance the VS Code experience as well. We're working together with the VS Code team to seeing how we can create the best debugging experience for our users. And we have an example of this. Most recently, we've actually created a new entry point to our extension, which is in the nightly debug build of JS Debug. And that is the built-in JavaScript debugging extension that comes with VS Code. And here we have a small demo of it. So this is a very normal debugging workflow where we're launching an Edge instance. And then, as you can probably notice, if you're connected to an Edge target, we have a new icon up here that is a link to our DevTools. So as you can see, you can set a breakpoint, connect to it, and then when you press this button, it will launch our extension and connect to the same browser instance that your debugging session is connected to. And if you don't happen to have the extension installed, what it does is it goes into VS Code, and VS Code will point to the download in the marketplace right in this tab. Okay, and now for this section, we're asking you to help us out. So we want you to tell us what we're missing. And we have a quick little survey that you can visit at aka.ms/edge extension survey. And it's anonymous and it's super quick. And it's really just trying to focus on, understanding developer workflow and what kind of features that you would like to see in our extension. And we'd love to learn about your experiences for this. And I'd like to thank you all for listening. And I'm just going to drop a couple of useful links. aka.ms/devtools for code is our extension. And then here's also a link to our GitHub page where you can track our progress, file issues, and everything else in between. Thank you all. And now I'm going to be opening up for Q&A and inviting Chris to join me up on stage.
Hello, everybody. You're muted this time.
Yeah, so up until we will have some questions, I have my own question. I'm a very big fan of performance tuning, and one of the things that I think is cool in Visual Studio, but is lacking in Visual Studio Code, for example, is the way to do performance monitoring and profiling in the tool. So, are you aiming to add this thing in the future, or is it part of the extension right now? Or, I would like to know that.
Well, in the developer tools in the browser, there's a performance tab which actually has a lot of features that also VS Code had VS had actually inside it. Mm-hmm. So there is also this is part of the Chromium project that also comes down from Chrome and other browsers based on the Chromium project, and there has been a lot of changes right now in that one. So if you Google I/O has just been and they announced a lot of new features in the performance tab, especially when it comes to the web fundamentals, like testing for different little details, finding it there. So I don't think there's much lacking in there. The bad news is that it's actually not going to be part of our extension because we're actually putting in things bit by bit. We didn't want to put in the whole developer tools inside Visual Studio Code. We wanted to bring the ones that actually are the most problematic ones. And the debugger, the inbuilt JavaScript debugger that's inside Visual Studio Code now also has features that are for performance testing that will be documented soon by them. So there's more going in that space. I think the biggest problem is that you always have this little rope walk, this tightrope walk, what you want to put into an IDE to keep it still small and lightweight, or if you want to actually take on the Visual Studios and the Xcodes of this world with an editor like Visual Studio Code. So I think depending on what people need to have, it would be more interesting to be able to turn these things on and off as you need them. And we realized in the last year, especially, that the developer tools have been around for 10 years, and there's so many different bits in there that people keep missing and not using. So we're actually starting to find out new ways to show you different parts of the developer tools as you need them. So there's a setting in there, an experiment at the moment, that you can actually have a sidebar inside the developer tools in the browser to give you different tasks. Like I do CSS debugging right now, or I do performance debugging, and I do like application development. And the performance debugging will see all the tools that are available in DevTools in the browser right now. So it has come leaps and bounds, and I think it's actually not far off what VS is actually offering you, of course, depending on the project that you run.
Cool. Are there any other questions from our audience? Something that you want to ask Chris or Michael? This is the time. So I guess that from what I saw in the session, from May until May, it took you something like 1 year to add this extension, or that extension was shipped half a year ago or something like that. When it went out to VS Code.
It has been around since the beginning, but it was an experimental feature. So the biggest problem that we have with getting things out from experimental to a state where it's a 1.0 is that we have to do a lot of like testing that it adheres to the standards that we're doing in Microsoft. So if it's an experiment, people can try it out, and it's an experimental feature that we just want to get some feedback on, but we needed to make sure that the performance of it as well, that the security is great, and especially what we needed to test out is the accessibility of it. So we wanted to make sure that actually a user that can only use that cannot use a mouse but only can use a keyboard can actually use it. A user that is blind that uses a screen reader, for example, will be able to use the developer tools in the browser and would also be able to use this extension inside Visual Studio Code. So that's why we actually moved from an experiment to a full version in this time period. The other thing was also, as Michael alluded to, we had this Elements extension, we had the network extension, and they both were maintained in parallel. So one of the first things I've done as the product manager is basically merge those two and say, like, this is actually a shell for all the developer tools that we have in the browser, and we can turn now on different tabs bit by bit. So Elements was the big thing that was missing in Visual Studio Code. The network was another one that is interesting to have in Visual Studio Code. The next request that people had was console, because everybody uses console logging instead of JS debugging or breakpoint debugging. So that's another big thing that people wanted. But we have the opportunity to bring all the bits of the developer tools inside an environment. But the bigger issue, of course, is like if they make sense or not. Like, for example, people in user tests, we find people asking us if the sources pane can come inside the extension inside Visual Studio Code. And I'm like, so you want to have an editor next to an editor? That makes no sense.
That makes no sense.
But it's I mean, it's an interesting feature still. It means that people haven't quite grasped the idea that what the extension does is take away the sources tab and actually put the functionality inside Visual Studio Code. Right now, when you're in the browser and you open the developer tools and you click on the link of the CSS, it opens it in the sources pane, and you're going away from the editor. You're going away from the JavaScript, from the CSS editor to the full text editor. So in this case, you will have now the JavaScript, the CSS tools and the HTML tools, and you have VS Code next to it. So we basically replaced the sources pane with VS Code, and that way we didn't have to get out of it. Another thing that I really
you gained context, because you lose context when you move from tab to tab when you're doing that. Yep.
Yeah, that's the biggest thing. I mean, I used to live in VS Code, my terminal, and in the browser, and I jumped between the three of them all the time. And by now, I realized that by command backtick, I can open a terminal inside VS Code and just do the few terminal commands or the build scripts or whatever, run these things directly in Visual Studio Code without actually having to leave it. And I use my terminal window less and less just for things that are really hardcore, on the operating system, but for most of my web tasks, I just use Visual Studio end to end. And this is Visual Studio Code. And this is something that I was missing in the developer tools, that we had this integration directly. The sources pane is great. It's an editor inside your browser. But if you already have it on the right-hand side of your, or in your case, on the left-hand side of your browser, you don't have enough space to edit. And this is something that we're trying to work around with that. What I also love is that you can set the browser to a headless mode or to a windowed mode. So if I actually have, for example, on my laptop, I have big enough window to just have a browser cast showing there, rather than having another browser window in the background that I need to jump between the two or resize my browser to give it space. So I really like that you can keep the integration directly into Visual Studio Code. That was also an issue we found on Mac, that basically in the past we opened a window, and if the window wasn't visible and if my Visual Studio Code was full screen, it actually, because of battery saving, Mac OS actually basically said this window is not active any longer. So the cast didn't work. So I had to resize my Visual Studio Code by 1 pixel, so that 1 pixel of the other window is still visible. Then the operating system was thinking. So we thought, like, how can we prevent this? And that's why we ended up with the headless mode. And to a degree, the integration is quite nice, because that's something that Visual Studio used to have for quite a while as well. You just run an instance of the browser in the background. But it's something that we find a lot of JavaScript developers are not using yet. I hinted at that one already, like breakpoint debugging is not as used by most JavaScript developers that just come from a web JavaScript to it and not from an enterprisey environment. And we hope that with a tool like that, and also with other things, we can make that easier and less scary to use, so more people will actually start embracing that more effective way of working. And this is where the survey can help us as well. So if you actually would love to fill that out, it's just 12 questions where we want to know, like, do you use breakpoints? Where are your pain points with breakpoints, and what can we do better? So I think there's a lot to be gained out there. It's great to do user tests and to see how people use your product, because we found a lot of like our own assumptions, because we're too close to the subject matter, made no sense. So it's great to actually get real information from people out there.
Okay. Sounds great. Do you want to add the link to the survey in the comments on YouTube? So if someone from our audience will want to share his thoughts, then they will be able.
I just did, yeah. It's there, aka.ms edge extension survey.
Okay, sounds cool.
It doesn't link it in the comments, which probably is a good thing, seeing what people comment online. But okay. I also tweeted about it. If you look at CodePoet on Twitter with an 8 at the end, I also tweeted the things out, and there's going to be more of this information later on. I'm going to blog about this later on and embed the live stream.
Cool. So I want to thank you, Michael, for your session. It was great. And for Chris, thanks for joining us for the Q&A. And we're going to move back to Hebrew and to the next speaker. So goodbye and thank you very much.